Chicago, July 22nd, 1934. As the city simmers through one of its hottest days in history, federal agents are setting the final trap for America's most wanted criminal. Within only 14 spectacular months, his bank robberies across the Midwest had propelled him from obscurity to public enemy number one. And on this night, his violent career would end in violence. His name was John Dillinger of Mooresville, Indiana, and his death would trigger a macabre national celebration.
John Dillinger, Prince of Crime. Chains, guards, and locksmiths, why, he laughed at them. He laughed at the law, and he laughed at death, too. But death laughed last as he brazenly left the Chicago movie theater. A blast of federal bullets, and Dillinger, public enemy number one, reached the end of his meteoric career.
Dillinger, the man and the myth. A WTTV news special. Dillinger, the man and the myth continues. Here is Jim Lockwood.
John Herbert Dillinger is buried here at the Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. His body lies under a thick blanket of concrete and scrap iron to prevent vandalism to the grave. For even today, he is a celebrity, a legend created by his own daredevilish career in crime and sensational coverage of his exploits in the news media of his day. Dillinger rose to fame in 1933 and 34, the post-Depression days when gangs of hold-up men struck bank after bank across the Midwest. Some of his contemporaries were Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie and Clyde, and Bob Barker and her gang. Of all the hold-up men of his era, Dillinger was especially glamorized, looked upon as a sort of Robin Hood who robbed banks because the banks robbed from the people. He was born in Indianapolis on June 22nd, 1903. The family home was in the 2000 block of Cooper Street, which has passed to oblivion now under the Interstate 70 inner loop through the city. Dillinger's father owned a grocery store just a few blocks away from the family home. At the age of 3, young John was left motherless and would be raised by an older sister, Audrey. Tougher than other boys in the neighborhood and bored with school, he dropped out at the age of 16. A year later, Dillinger's father, now remarried, sold the grocery business and moved to a farm near Mooresville. Young John got some jobs, but never stayed with them very long. Mostly, he played baseball, at which he was quite good, and shot pool at Martinsville. The elder Dillinger had always tried to instill his own strong moral and religious principles in his son, but he seldom praised and often punished the boy for the slightest offenses. In 1923, John enlisted in the Navy, assigned to the USS Utah. But he had problems. After going AWOL twice and being court-martialed, Dillinger simply walked away from the ship and the Navy after serving only 3 months. After returning to Mooresville, Dillinger married 16-year-old Beryl Hovius of Martinsville in April of 1924. But he continued his old habits of shooting pool and staying out late at night. On one of those nights, in September of 1924, Dillinger and an accomplice, a former convict named Edgar Singleton, tried to rob an elderly Mooresville grocer. As Dillinger attacked from hiding, the old man fought back. Dillinger's pistol went off, but hit nothing, and Dillinger ran. Singleton, supposedly driving the getaway car, had already driven away. Convinced that his son would get leniency by telling the truth, the elder Dillinger persuaded his son to make a full confession and plead guilty. Foregoing any legal counsel whatsoever at his trial, Dillinger was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in the Pendleton Reformatory for his attempted robbery, and he went to prison carrying a bitter grudge against society. He had been married less than 5 months before being sentenced, and now his young bride's visits grew more and more infrequent. She finally filed for divorce in April of 1929. Shortly after, Dillinger was transferred to the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City at his own request. He had claimed that the state prison had a better baseball team, and he wanted to play ball there. But once transferred, he never played baseball at Michigan City. There is a theory that he requested the transfer because by that time he had already made up his mind to pursue a criminal career. And Michigan City was where he could get the schooling he needed, schooling from the best teachers, the elite of Indiana crime. Following repeated denials, Dillinger was finally paroled on May 22nd, 1933. He had served 8.5 years behind bars, and within 2 weeks, he was back to crime. After holding up a few grocery and drugstores in Indianapolis, Dillinger teamed with Harry Copeland, a parolee and former acquaintance from the state prison, and started hitting banks. June 10, New Carlisle, Ohio. July 17, Indiana's tiny Bank of Daleville. August 4, the First National Bank of Montpelier, Indiana. Now joined by another old friend from prison, bank robber and machine gun expert Homer Van Meter, the gang continued. August 14th, the Citizens National Bank of Bluffton, Ohio. August 18, Grand Haven, Michigan. September 6, the Massachusetts Avenue State Bank in downtown Indianapolis. So far, the gang had made off with more than $60,000, and a few patterns were emerging that were to become Dillinger trademarks. He would get to the money by making a swashbuckling vault over the railing into the teller's cages. On several occasions, he told customers to keep the money they were holding, explaining, "We want the bank's money, not yours." And he always carried several pounds of roofing nails in the getaway car to be tossed on the road ahead of pursuing police vehicles. Such is the stuff of which legends are made. On September 21st, 1933, Dillinger was arrested by police in Dayton, Ohio, as he visited a girlfriend. 4 days later, 10 inmates escaped from the state prison using guns that Dillinger had financed and arranged to be smuggled in. Among the escapees, Dillinger's old friend from Pendleton and Michigan City, Harry Pierpont, bank robber. Charles Makeley, bank robber. Russell Clark, bank robber. And John Hamilton, a specialist in auto theft. Those four, along with Harry Copeland, Homer Van Meter, and later Babyface Nelson, were to become the main force of the future Dillinger gang. But first, they had to get Dillinger out of jail. After robbing a bank in St. Mary's, Ohio, the group of escapees went to the county jail in Lima. They marched in, shot Sheriff Jess Sarber to death in front of his hysterical wife, and drove away with Dillinger into the night. Now the gang needed weapons, and they knew where to get them. On October 14th, the day of Sheriff Sarber's funeral, they held up the police station at Auburn, Indiana, taking machine guns, pistols, shotguns, ammunition, and bulletproof vests. 6 days later, the same thing happened at the police station in Peru. 3 days after that, the gang held up the Central National Bank of Greencastle for $18,000. 2 police station holdups and a bank robbery all within 10 days caused quite a stir in Indiana, to say the least. Sheriff Buck Sumner of Marion County won council approval to build a bulletproof cage at the jail and to buy a machine gun for it. The Indiana American Legion offered to arm 30,000 of its members to patrol Hoosier highways, and the National Guard said it was prepared to use tanks, airplanes, and poison gas to aid the police. The Indiana Bankers Association started a fund drive for a statewide one-way radio system. Governor Paul McNutt agreed to increase the state police budget for weapons and pursuit cars and instructed sheriffs across the state to deputize anyone willing to help stop Dillinger's so-called terror gang. Despite all of that, Dillinger remained at large, now based in Chicago. And incredible as it seems, there is some evidence that Dillinger was planning to raid Fort Benjamin Harrison, the Army installation just outside of Indianapolis. 3 men, later identified as Dillinger and 2 other of his gang members, visited the fort in late October of 1933, posing of all things as Oriental rug salesmen. It appears that their real purpose was to look over the base in preparation for a raid on the arsenal, which included automatic weapons and mortars. Whatever Dillinger may have had in mind, he never tried to carry it through. In mid-November, Dillinger and his new girlfriend, a French Indian beauty named Billy Frechette, whose husband was in jail, outdrove pursuing police to escape a trap in Chicago. But 3 days later, he and his associates were back in action, holding up a bank in Racine, Wisconsin. And it was one of their more spectacular performances, down to their flamboyant getaway car, a 1934 blue Buick with yellow wire wheels. It was stolen, of course. During the course of the robbery, in which a police officer was wounded by the gang's machine gun fire, Dillinger came up with a new getaway trick: hostages. By the time the gang was ready to leave, the jangling alarm bell outside the building had attracted a rather sizable group of curious spectators, peering into the windows and crowding into the street. The street was so crowded, in fact, that the gang and their hostages had to literally push their way through the spectators to reach their car. The hostages were forced to stand on the running boards, and shielded from police, the bandits drove off. The hostages were later released not far away, as they always were with Dillinger. Dillinger was to be charged with murder early in 1934. An East Chicago, Indiana policeman was machine gunned to death during a holdup on January 15th. Although he was to deny it for the rest of his life, several witnesses identified Dillinger as the gunman. At the farm in Mooresville, the elder Dillinger rose to his son's defense.
I don't know where my son John is at, and I don't know anything about when he'll ever get back or whether he ever will or not. And I don't think he's hardly had a fair deal. He's been accused of everything that happened, and every bank or everything, anything that's held up was laid on to John. Sometimes 2 or 3 different places on the same day. If John could be exonerated from this crime and come back home, I think he'd make a good citizen or a good officer of some kind.
Slipping through the Midwestern dragnet, the Dillinger gang took refuge in Tucson, Arizona, only to be arrested there by alert and suspicious police. The arrest of Russell Clark, Charles Makeley, Harry Pierpont, Dillinger, and their female companions made national headlines. Lake County prosecutor Robert Estill, considered well on his way to becoming governor of Indiana, went to Tucson immediately and hastily made arrangements to have Dillinger flown back to Indiana to stand trial for the murder of the East Chicago officer. Prosecutor Estill would later claim that Dillinger was talkative during the flight and indirectly confessed to the slaying. Estill quoted Dillinger as saying, "It was self-defense. He was going to stop us," a statement that, if true, speaks volumes about Dillinger's attitudes and rationale. Taken under heavy guard to the jail at Crown Point, Dillinger was treated like a celebrity. A news photographer told Estill to put his arm around the outlaw. The prosecutor, exhausted from the trip from Tucson, thoughtlessly obliged, and Dillinger mockingly rested his arm on Estill's shoulder. The resulting photographs appeared in newspapers across the country. They rocked Indiana politics and ruined Estill's political future. There is an interesting curiosity about the pictures of that moment. Note the extended index finger of Dillinger's right hand. It is not a natural position for a hand at rest. Some believe that Dillinger was signaling his associates still at large to get a gun to him. We'll never know for sure, but we do know that Dillinger would soon have a gun, and he would use it to make an outrageously simple escape from the Crown Point jail. It is unknown how Dillinger got hold of a gun. He would later claim that it was a wooden pistol he had whittled while in jail, but there is evidence that it was a real weapon. A .45 automatic, possibly smuggled in after his attorney is alleged to have bribed a judge. With the jail surrounded by police and National Guardsmen to prevent a rescue attempt by other gang members, Dillinger stuck his weapon into the stomach of an elderly cell block attendant and quickly captured a deputy. Using his hostages, Dillinger then captured 3 more deputies and the warden. Making his way to the outer office, Dillinger held a National Guardsman at bay while he gathered up 2 machine guns. Moving through the kitchen, he then went to the garage in the rear of the jail, and with a mechanic and the deputy as hostages, he sped away in the sheriff's own car. Dillinger released his hostages on a back road, giving them $4 and waving as he drove off toward Chicago. It was March 3rd, 1934, barely 5 weeks after his capture in Tucson. The morning after his Crown Point escape, Dillinger was public enemy number 1, the most hunted man in America. And a young and little-known agency called the FBI had now entered the case on the strength of new federal legislation. The outlaw moved quickly. Within 3 days of his escape, Dillinger and a new gang were robbing a bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, once more having to push their way through more than 1,000 spectators pressing around the bank and filling the street, and once more taking hostages to shield their getaway. One member of the new group was a particularly vicious and irrational character named Lester Gillis, better known as Babyface Nelson. His boyish looks hid an addiction to violence, and he was the first of Dillinger's associates who actually enjoyed using a gun. Just 6 days after the Sioux Falls holdup, the gang struck again in Mason City, Iowa. But Dillinger's luck was changing. He was hit in the shoulder by a bullet fired from across the street. The FBI and police in 5 states were now trying to find him. A week after the Mason City robbery, they did, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dillinger and Billy Frechette shot their way out of the trap, escaping down the back stairs of their apartment. And Dillinger now acted with his characteristic brazen bravado. In spite of the manhunt, he and Billy Frechette visited the family farm at Mooresville. On April 8th, there was a family reunion with carloads of relatives coming for a big chicken dinner. The special guest posed for pictures, displaying the wooden gun he claimed to have used in his Crown Point escape. Virtually everyone in Mooresville knew John was at the farm, but incredibly, no one ever tipped the police. They respected the Dillinger family too much for that, and most of the community felt that John had gotten a raw deal in his first brush with the law 10 years earlier. And after all, he was a hometown celebrity. Some of the family and neighbors were convinced that the FBI was patrolling the area, but never caught on to what was happening. April 9, the day after the family picnic, John and Billy were back in Chicago, where Billy was taken into custody as she walked into a tavern where federal agents had set another trap. Dillinger, sensing that something was wrong, drove away. Always on the run, Dillinger and his group headed for a few days of rest at an isolated lodge in upper Wisconsin, a place called Little Bohemia. The proprietor's nervous wife got word to the FBI, and Melvin Purvis, heading the Dillinger manhunt from his office in Chicago, flew to Little Bohemia with a group of fellow agents. On the night of April 22nd, 17 FBI agents were fanned out in front of the lodge when 3 men walked out. Unable to hear FBI orders to halt, the men kept walking to their car, and when they started to drive away, the FBI opened fire. In the car were 3 innocent men who had stopped by the lodge for a nightcap. One was killed in the hail of federal bullets, the other 2 severely wounded. The Dillinger gang, meanwhile, had escaped through the back of the lodge, leaving 3 of their women companions to be captured. Babyface Nelson made his way to a neighboring cottage, where he went berserk with his machine gun, killing 1 FBI agent and seriously wounding 2 other officers. He eventually would make his way back to Chicago. Dillinger and 2 other gang members, Homer Van Meter and John Hamilton, stole a car from a nearby home. Near St. Paul, police spotted them. The outlaws eluded the police in a running gun battle in which Hamilton was mortally wounded. The blood-stained car was later found abandoned on a north side Chicago street. True to form, Dillinger had driven into the very heart of America's largest manhunt. While the FBI was facing a storm of public criticism over the fiasco of Little Bohemia, Dillinger was forced far underground. There was now a total of $20,000 on his head. Through underworld contacts, he had plastic surgery performed on his face and made an unsuccessful attempt to alter his fingerprints with acid. And with Billy Frechette now in prison, Dillinger found a new girlfriend, Polly Hamilton. Possibly emboldened by his facial surgery, Dillinger moved with her under the very noses of police. There is evidence that he and Polly frequently went to restaurants, shopping, to baseball games at Wrigley Field, and to the Chicago World's Fair. To her, he was Jimmy Lawrence. She never knew who he really was until after his death. But Polly Hamilton's landlady had figured out who he was. Her name was Anna Sage, and she would lead Dillinger into his final trap and be known to history as the Lady in Red.
Dillinger, the man and the myth continues. Here is Jim Lockwood.
Anna Sage was a 42-year-old Romanian immigrant with a record of running houses of prostitution in the Chicago area. Now facing deportation as an undesirable alien, she believed that she could use her knowledge of Dillinger's whereabouts as leverage with the authorities to save herself. Through intermediaries, Mrs. Sage contacted the FBI's Melvin Purvis, who promised nothing except that she would be rewarded. Mrs. Sage then told Purvis that she would accompany Dillinger and Polly Hamilton to the movies the next night and would probably go to the Marlboro Theater. The next day, July 22nd, Mrs. Sage called Purvis to say that the trio might also go to the Biograph Theater instead. While other officers watched the Marlboro, Purvis and his men went to the Biograph.
It wasn't long before he saw Anna Sage and her two companions walk into the theater. Mrs. Sage wore an orange dress that took on a bright red hue under the marquee lights. This is the Biograph Theater as it stands today in Chicago. On that hot July night in 1934, the show inside was Manhattan Melodrama, starring Clark Gable. While Dillinger watched the show, 18 FBI agents and police detectives from East Chicago, Indiana, positioned themselves on both sides of the entrance, across the street, at all the exits, in an alley a few doors down from the theater, and in doorways leading to that alley. As Dillinger and his female companions left the theater, they walked together towards the alley. The FBI's Melvin Purvis, standing in a doorway, struck a match as a signal, and the lawmen began falling in and closing in behind Dillinger. Finally, and too late, sensing the trap, Dillinger began running, reaching into his pocket for a .45 caliber automatic. But the officers opened fire, and John Dillinger fell dead at the entrance to the alley. Dillinger's death and funeral were surrounded by a circus atmosphere. Following positive identification at the morgue, the body was placed on view for the public. There were thousands passing by in a bizarre display of public curiosity about this celebrated outlaw. 2 days later, 6 husky men had to fight their way through a crowd of 5,000 as they carried Dillinger's wicker casket to the hearse for the trip back home. At Mooresville, Dillinger's body was put on display at the E.F. Harvey Funeral Home, where hundreds lined up to view it. It became such a confusing scene that the body was again moved, this time to the home of Dillinger's sister on the southwest side of Indianapolis. Again, hundreds lined up, hoping to see the body. Some were tourists from as far as California. Dillinger was buried at Crown Hill Cemetery that same day, while a crowd of 5,000 pressed against the high iron fence and endured a thunderstorm to watch. John Dillinger was 31 years old when he died, but in that short lifetime he became a legend that is difficult to define. Depending upon your perspective, he was a Robin Hood, although there is no evidence that he ever gave a stolen dime to anyone, a vicious killer, a misunderstood young man, a stupid hoodlum, or a brilliant but misguided professional who knew Midwestern back roads so well that he could travel for hundreds of miles without ever passing through a single town. And there are historians who believe that if Dillinger actually did kill the East Chicago policeman, it was an accident. He was never accused of any other murders. Despite positive identification to the satisfaction of the family, rumors persist even today that it was not Dillinger but an unfortunate double who died that night in Chicago. The Dillinger myth was created by the public and harried police, exaggerated and exploited by newspapers of his day. But the myth wasn't all fiction either. John Dillinger obviously knew he was the center of national attention, and almost certainly he relished it. In many ways, Dillinger the man lived up to Dillinger the myth, and sometimes even surpassed it. In his brief appearance on the stage of American crime, John Dillinger had become a superstar.
John could be exonerated from this crime and come back home, I think he'd make a good citizen or a good officer of some kind.